to be talking about Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. We're going to look at how we design an aquaponic system to minimize, and the environment in which the aquaponic system is built, to minimize the incidences of pest problems in our aquaponic system. Additionally, we're going to look at how we can identify and treat for a number of different pests that are common in aquaponic system growing environments and in greenhouse growing environments. So we're going to look at pest identification and pest management. We'll talk about some beneficial insects that can be used for different types of pests and some chemical sprays and soft sprays that we can utilize in and around an aquaponic system. We're also going to talk about prey-predator relationships in the context of utilizing beneficial insects as a preventative method of dealing with pest problems. We'll talk about why IPM plans are critical to implement before you actually have a pest problem and how typically IPM isn't something that's reactive. We'll look in the context of integrated pest management at things like banker plants, the use of trap plants and pollen plants and other feed plants in order to maintain beneficial populations of insects, of beneficial predatory insects, over time in our growing environment. So this is going to be all about pest management and mitigating incidences of pest outbreaks and the resulting crop loss and crop damage from pest outbreaks inside of the context of an aquaponic growing environment. In this section, we'll also be looking at things like molds and mildews as well, because again, there are a number of agents that are used for managing pest populations in a growing environment that can be used to mitigate and address things like downy mildew or powdery mildew inside of an aquaponic system growing environment. So we'll look at pests and molds and mildews in this section. In this first lecture, we're going to look at the fundamentals of IPM and start to identify some key vocabulary and terms that we use when discussing pest management in a growing environment. So we're going to start off with some key vocabulary and laying down some terms so that when we're discussing different pest management plans or different ways to manage pests in our growing environment, we know exactly what it is we're focusing on and what it is we're talking about. So a good place to start would be to define Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. So Integrated Pest Management is a strategic use of facility design, crop selection, beneficial insect release and management, and targeted soft sprays to manage greenhouse pests. Integrated pest management plans can be incredibly broad-reaching and have a lot of different facets or moving parts. So in facilities that I know are implementing or utilizing integrated pest management plans, they might actually control where people are coming from before they enter their growing environment. So let's say even if I have 2 or 3 facilities that I need to visit during the course of the day, and I know that one facility has a very structured integrated pest management plan, and they use a biosecure entrance to their growing environment, and they've got a very stable population of beneficial insects managing their pest population, and I know that the other facility that I'm going to that day is known for having pest problems, doesn't really utilize a good integrated pest management plan, and typically is experiencing pest outbreaks, I'll make sure that I schedule my dates that I go to the cleaner environment first so that I'm not carrying bugs with me from a more pest-ridden greenhouse to a clean greenhouse. All of these things can come into play when setting up an integrated pest management plan and when executing an integrated pest management plan in your growing environment. Things like what sprays you're using, what beneficial insects you're releasing, how you've designed your greenhouse with or without biosecure entrances and insect screens over your shutter intakes and your air vents. Even things like crop rotations that you're establishing, when you're planting certain crops, what plants you're planting next to each other. All of these things come into play when you're designing a comprehensive integrated pest management for your growing environment. And just to be clear, different growing environments or growing environments with different purposes will have different levels of pest management plans enacted. If you're an educational facility and you've got students coming and going all day, and your general purpose of your system is to teach growing, or you're using the system as a horticultural therapy center, you might not have as strict of a pest management plan as a production greenhouse that's producing commercial tomatoes or commercial leafy greens. So it's a spectrum, and depending on your situation and your budget and what it is you're trying to do with your aquaponic system and your growing environment, you're going to structure your integrated pest management differently. Integrated pest management plans are not necessarily one size fits all, and they're tailored heavily to crops being grown, where you're growing, your growing environment, and the purpose of your system. When we talk about pest management in a greenhouse, a pest is any insect that directly or indirectly causes crop damage or loss. So when we talk about greenhouse pests, we typically think of insects that directly eat our crops or eat the plants that we're trying to grow. But technically a greenhouse pest could be something like a shorefly, which doesn't actually eat plant matter during any part of its growth cycle, but it can introduce fungal infections and pathogens into your growing environment through its fecal matter. So a pest is any insect that directly or indirectly causes crop damage or loss. Beneficials or beneficial insects or predatory insects, there's a number of terms that are used, can be introduced or not, and that is a very important point. The fact that, yes, typically beneficial insects are purchased and brought into the growing environment and released, and their populations are intentionally cultivated in the growing environment, but there are a number of beneficial insects that can commonly be found in growing environments that are not pests, and in fact can help manage your pest populations. And so even though you didn't intentionally introduce them, they are still beneficial insects. And this is one of the really important reasons why we need to be able to identify greenhouse pests, so that we can distinguish them from beneficial insects and even beneficial insects that we didn't necessarily release in our growing environment. Typically, beneficial insects are insects that prey on greenhouse pests. So looking at the fundamentals of IPM, integrated pest management plans involve a balanced relationship between the uses of chemical insecticides and beneficial insects in order to combat pest populations. Integrated pest management does not necessarily mean chemical-free, and there are a lot of people that get hung up on this and they think because I'm using beneficials in my growing environment, I automatically can't use any chemical sprays. And that's not the case, and we're going to look at some chemical sprays that we commonly use inside of our growing environments. The important thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to use a spray, it needs to be used in a targeted manner to address a pest problem in a specific location. This is because most sprays are indiscriminate and will kill your beneficials just as effectively as they kill the pests. And as previously mentioned, integrated pest management plans and strategies are tailored to specific crops, geographies, and growing seasons. A very important note here when talking about integrated pest management plans, and we're going to see why this is the case in the next couple lectures, is that integrated pest management plans are a preventative practice that must be established and maintained, ideally prior to you having a pest problem in your greenhouse. Integrated pest management strategies are not a good solution for addressing a pest outbreak in your greenhouse. So having no IPM plan established and then trying to quickly establish an IPM plan when you see an outbreak of aphids or whiteflies or thrips isn't going to work. And we'll really dig into the reasons why when we talk about prey-predator relationships and the rates at which certain greenhouse pests can reproduce. So, the cardinal rule of integrated pest management, and this is incredibly important to establishing and maintaining a proper integrated pest management plan in your growing environment. Not everything that creeps or crawls is a pest. So many times people see something moving on their leaves and they squish it or kill it or spray for it. I have gone into greenhouses where they've had a small number of aphids in their greenhouse and they've had a good number of aphidious wasps, and all they see is bugs flying around and they go, holy cow, I have an outbreak of something, and they just blanket spray everything. And that's not how integrated pest management works. Integrated pest management depends entirely on you as the greenhouse manager or as the grower being able to identify and distinguish various greenhouse pests and beneficial insects. Broad spectrum mass application of insecticides disrupt the balance of an effective integrated pest management plan.